Well, the New Orleans Saints have their quarterback in Derek Carr, but now what? We got all that and a little bit of land yap for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget we're free and available on all podcast apps and on YouTube as well. I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credential member of the media, CrescentCitySports.com, USA Today's Saints Wire, Tuesdays on Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, as we continue to highlight the importance of what the New Orleans Saints were able to get done on Monday, the signing and acquisition of quarterback Derek Carr. We're going to start off, or we're going to wrap up today's show updating you on Derek Carr's contract structure, maybe some numbers here to make you feel a little bit better if you believe that the Saints overpaid. They did not when it comes to Derek Carr. I'll show you the numbers and how you can look at that from a lens of reality, of like a different reality around that contract. We'll also take a look at what's next for the New Orleans Saints, because signing Derek Carr is not the end. It's just the beginning of what the New Orleans Saints need to do to be competitive next season. But first, how does Derek Carr change the New Orleans Saints offense, if at all? Well, there's one sort of easy thing to look at here, because the New Orleans Saints do have everything they need at their disposal to have a better offense in 2023 than they had in 2022. That a lot of that has to do with the weapons, but Derek Carr helps there too. He can deliver an accurate ball. He's pretty accurate downfield. Average depth of target. He doesn't mind pushing the ball downfield, despite what you might have seen in his sort of like John Gruden, Rich Bisaccia offenses we saw last year when it came to the Josh McDaniels offense in Las Vegas. Derek Carr tied for fourth when it came to average depth of target. So he brings you a 3-level attacker at quarterback, but one that is always going to be willing to take what the offense gives him. One that will always be willing to attack the middle of the field, dump the passes off, take the safe choice. Those are things that the Raiders didn't maximize last year. 14 interceptions last season. Remember, the leader in interceptions last year was Dak Prescott, I believe tied. I believe there was another person there with 15 interceptions, which is one of the lowest totals to ever lead the NFL, by the way. So even a 14 interception year isn't that bad when it comes to Derek Carr. It's just more than you're used to seeing in New Orleans when Drew Brees was setting records for only throwing 7-8 interceptions in a season. So the way that Derek Carr changes the offense is that it gets the offense to a little bit more of a familiar operation as to what Drew Brees and New Orleans Saints offense had been in the past, particularly 2017-18 and on. Now, I want to be very clear about the expectation that I'm presenting when I say that. What I'm not saying at all is that Derek Carr is Drew Brees. But what I'm saying is that Derek Carr gets them a step closer than what they had with Andy Dalton last year, what they had with an injured Jameis Winston over the course of the past couple of years. And we know that Jameis started off massively efficient in Sean Payton's offense with Sean Payton at the helm back in 2021. But in 2022, that just simply wasn't what the New Orleans Saints were looking to do. They wanted to attack a little bit more vertically in addition to attacking laterally. Derek Carr gives them the ability to be able to do that, but being a good decision maker, being a good, accurate passer gets them there. Now, does Derek Carr immediately make this team a Super Bowl caliber team? No. The Saints still have to continue to build around Derek Carr, build around this offense. So we're going to get to that a little bit when we discuss what's next for the New Orleans Saints, and then we'll unlock a little bit in terms of how the Saints contract for Derek Carr will help them do that. But the other thing to keep in mind is that one of the things that the Saints struggled with last year wasn't necessarily the quarterback play. It was drops, interceptions, fumbles, or I guess interceptions are quarterback play, my apologies, but like fumbles, particularly in the run game, a couple of fumbles by Chris Olave at important moments on the field, some poor decision-making as well across the team, and as well as, some tendencies and traits that were not impactful for the New Orleans Saints at all in 2022 in terms of their play calling. So some of this comes down to how does Derek Carr make the New Orleans Saints better? Yes, but the Saints still have to be better for Derek Carr as well. They have to be willing to put their best and biggest pieces on the field in their biggest moments on the field in games. You remember the second down play when Andy Dalton was, flushed out of the pocket and he had an option to either throw to Kirk Merritt or throw to Taysom Hill. And neither Rashid Shaheed nor Chris Olave nor Alvin Kamara were on the field for those plays. The play in which Mark Ingram ran out of bounds a yard short because of the injury when Alvin Kamara could have been out on the field. Yeah, he had his helmet off, but call a timeout, get everything reset, and then keep track of what you need to in order to get your best players on the field in the biggest moments. So those decisions are away from Derek Carr. They have nothing to do with Derek Carr, but those are decisions that are going to have to be made to a better extent in 2023 than they were in 2022 in order to maximize what it is that Derek Carr can bring to your team. Here are the other things too. You have short yardage cheat codes. When Alvin Kamara is available, him on a 2nd and 1, 3rd and 1, put the ball in his hands. When Taysom Hill is available, you're on a 3rd and 1, maybe even a 4th and 1, or you're in the red zone, put the ball in his hands. Same thing with Alvin Kamara. Utilize him in the red zone. Those are things that are beyond Derek Carr, but you have no excuses at this point but to maximize the talent because you went and got the quarterback that you wanted, which means you've told the world, we have our guy. Now, make sure your guys are on the field to support your guy. Hope that makes sense. So that becomes a big part of it as well. Oh, and by the way, running on 2nd and 10 after an incomplete pass, as often as the New Orleans Saints did in 2022, that is also another habit that cannot be replicated in 2023. So where Derek Carr changes your offense is that he probably makes your coaching staff a lot more confident. There was not a lot of confidence that Andy Dalton would be able to run an offense that was built for Jameis Winston. Now, they did it, and let's be real, Andy Dalton didn't have a terrible year. He was never going to win them a playoff game. He was never going to take them to the Super Bowl, anything like that. But a big part of the sort of disconnect between who the New Orleans Saints wanted to be last year and who they turned out to be last year was that they didn't have the right quarterback out on the field. They had spent the entire offseason building a roster that reflected Jameis Winston's skill sets, right? They gave him 2 possession receivers, a speedy deep threat. You kind of developed another speedy deep threat in Rashid Shaheed. You had Juwan Johnson ready to go. Taysom Hill was supposed to take this big receiving role. You had Alvin Kamara in the backfield. So there were all of these pieces around that were built to support Jameis Winston. And then there was a system built thereby, meaning that it was a system built for Jameis Winston. Then they had to try to get Andy Dalton to run Jameis Winston's system with a system that was built for Jameis Winston while having a wildly different skill set. And changing up everything mid-season isn't very reliable. I mean, we've spoken about this before, the analogy that my good friend Tyler Rowland for over at Locked on Titans uses to where you get in somebody else's car, you got to adjust the mirrors, you got to realign the seat, you got to change the steering wheel, you got to get your rear view mirrors set, your side view mirrors set, all these other things. You have to recalibrate everything when you switch over the driver in an offense like that. And the Saints were not going to be able to do that midseason. They certainly did not have the opportunity to do that from what they had built at the beginning of the season. But now, inherently, things get a little bit better. So Derek Carr gives you a safe passer, an accurate passer, a guy who can deliver passes on time, a guy who can anticipate, and a guy that usually makes smart decisions. What are the 14 interceptions in each of the last 2 years who he is now, or did that have to do with the system that he was playing in? That's the question that Derek Carr is going to need to answer. And then the other piece is that he gives you somebody that this coaching staff is confident with. They wanted Derek Carr. This is not a situation that they were waiting around to see who was going to say yes or anything like that. They wanted Derek Carr from the very beginning. And that is something that tells you that this New Orleans Saints offensive staff is ready to be very confident with Derek Carr and build to his strengths. And so if they can build an offense around him and he appears for 17, 18, 19 games, however many games the Saints end up playing in 2023, if they make the playoffs, that's the main difference. He plays in the system that was built for him that inherently makes some things better. But you have to get more around him right and settled. The New Orleans Saints are off to a good start in their offseason, but this is just the beginning. They're far from done. What do they have to do next? Got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked on Saints, part of Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked on Saints brought to you by our friends at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And yeah, the NFL season is over, but the NBA season is on and running. So if you want to go ahead and get in on some of that, especially if you are a first-time customer, things get even better for you because you get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's bonus bets that come back if your first bet doesn't win, which means there's no losing when it comes to your first bet at FanDuel. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app today. It's safe, it's secure, it's super easy to use, and you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores to point spreads to threes drained to assists. There's so many different ways for you to get in on it. And if you want, you can even combine some of those into a same game parlay for your chance at an even bigger payout. So don't miss out on your chance today for your no sweat first bet of up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/locked-on. That's FanDuel.com/locked-on. Make every moment count with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Yeah, the New Orleans Saints have their quarterback for 2023 and beyond, but that doesn't mean that the job is done. There's still some work to do, particularly over on the offensive side. And don't worry, there's still work to be done on the defensive side as well. Appreciate you as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day, every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, the New Orleans Saints solved their quarterback problem, right? Andy Dalton was a free agent. It's always looked like the time between the New Orleans Saints and Jameis Winston was coming to an end here this offseason, and it looks like even more so now that that's the case. Be interesting to see how the Saints handle the Jameis Winston situation. They can cut him loose right now. There's just an outright release, save $4.4 million against the salary cap, or they could designate him as a post-June 1 cut, save $12.8 million against the salary cap. He'll be able to immediately go and start negotiating with teams, could even sign a deal, all of that. But the Saints would have to carry that cap hit all the way through until June 2nd. Not the end of the world, but certainly and certainly something that they can afford to do. But now they got quarterback taken care of. What's next? So let's start over on the offensive side. And we'll just kind of go position group by position group here to outline the New Orleans Saints needs at every position on the offensive side. On the offensive line, what are you going to do with Andrew Speed? Is he your guy at left guard? He's somebody you could also designate as a post-June 1 cut. If you do that, you could end up saving a little bit of extra money there as well. So is that something that the Saints are interested in doing? If they are, then they'll have to make sure that they know for sure what their sort of next step is when it comes to left guard. Do they just turn things over and plug in James Hurst there? Or do they end up going for maybe a situation like drafting an Osiris Torrance out of Florida in the first round? If the Saints were to designate Andrew Speed as a post-June 1 cut, $11.8 million saved against the cap. But again, they would have to carry that all the way until June 2nd. If they cut him loose right now, only $1.4 million are saved. More like 1.387, but we'll just call it 1.4. So we'll see if the Saints decide to restructure his contract. I will answer your question right away. But that's a place where the Saints could certainly do some work on the offensive line. Also, shoring up the depth there in case somebody does get injured and they have to go to somebody a little bit further down the depth chart. Do they have the guys that are ready to be able to do that? And there are already a couple of guys that we know that they like there. They like Calvin Throckmorton, for instance. They like James Hurst. But who else are you adding to that group? Can you go to the draft and grab like a Jackson Kirkland out of Washington a little bit later than you would have to grab an Osiris Torrance, just so you have that good depth piece ready to go on your offensive line? So it'd be interesting to see how they go about that. But considering the injuries over the course of the past few years, shoring up depth and figuring out what you're going to do at left guard, very important for your success as a team, but also Derek Carr's success as a quarterback as well. You want him to have time. Let's bounce now to the backfield at running back. Alvin Kamara set to potentially miss at least 6 games as his ongoing legal process continues. That is one that has its next step July 31st, right during camp, in which he has his trial. At that point, there could be a decision made and the legal process could come to an end, and that would mean that the NFL's discipline process would then begin. You would expect to have some appeals, things like that. There would be a part of that, and then that would stretch on. But very likely that Alvin Kamara misses about 6 games, at least 6 games in 2023. So you're looking to add a running back. One of my favorite things that you can do is go into free agency, add a running back. You could do that with guys like Alexander Mattison, Rashad Penny, Dearness Johnson, get your power runners in free agency, and then go and grab one of those young, flashy runners in this year's NFL draft. Not only do you have Alvin Kamara, but you still have Eno Benjamin under 1 year of a deal as well. Remember, they picked him up off of waivers, meaning they assumed the remainder of the contract that he was still on. So Eno Benjamin is a New Orleans Saint as of right now in 2023. So then you go to the draft and you get yourself a dynamic player. You grab a Bijan Robinson if he drops out of the first round, or if you like him enough to take him in the first round. You grab a Jahmyr Gibbs if you want somebody that's an immediate clone to Alvin Kamara. You grab Tajay Spears because you want to take him from uptown over to, I almost said megaphone, over to Metairie, right? Like there's a lot of different ways you can go. Kenny McIntosh, Roshan Johnson. There's so many different names that you can find in this year's draft that could be impactful for the New Orleans Saints. So running back is a big one. Tight end, you pretty much just want to lock down Juwan Johnson, right? Whether that be on a restricted free agent tender and then matching an offer sheet if one comes in, give him a second round tender, see how that goes, or just locking down a long-term deal with him. I think the New Orleans Saints would very much like to keep Juwan Johnson. In fact, I know the New Orleans Saints would very much like to keep Juwan Johnson. Just can they get it done in a way that's amicable and that's workable for both the team and the player? You could also add some talent at tight end if you want to. You can go and grab a Darnell Washington out of Georgia, who's very Darren Waller-like, and then pair that receiving threat up with Derek Carr. Or you can go and grab yourself a blocker in this year's draft, one of the Iowa tight ends that ends up helping you there, or you can look to free agency. So I don't think that there's just one move to be made in free agency. I think holding on to Juwan Johnson is one, but probably adding another talent, maybe a versatile talent, a little bit more of a blocker, but can also be your pass catcher, would be a good option for New Orleans as well. Or you go all out and grab that Darnell Washington pick out of Georgia, like we mentioned. At wide receiver, this has got to be the big one, right? You want that contested catch 50-50 Paul guy? There's two places you can do it. You can go to free agency and find, well, actually, technically three. You can go to free agency, find that guy. You can go to the draft and find that guy. Or you work with the guy that's already in your building and Michael Thomas, rework a deal that's very incentive heavy in terms of availability as well as performance-based incentives, and get him to stay in New Orleans, get another year with him and Derek Carr. He already showed you on Twitter how excited he is that Derek Carr is a New Orleans Saints quarterback. So expect the two of them to be having conversations here very, very quickly, and the Saints to begin work to court Michael Thomas back to New Orleans. If they get that done, they get that contested catch receiver that Dennis Allen told us in his end of year media availability that they wish that they had in 2022, but lost because of his injury. That's a place where they would be able to get that back. And you know what? They could also still add talent at the position just to be ready, just in case there's another injury to be concerned about. Now, over on the defensive side, we don't necessarily have to go position by position here. We know that the Saints are looking probably for some safety depth. We'll see what happens with Caden Ellis when it comes to linebacker. Maybe that's a spot that they end up investing as well, whether it be in the draft or free agency. But there's a lot of linebackers available in this class, so it does mean that the Saints might be in a good place to keep Caden Ellis. But as a high-ranking Saints official staff member told me, it only takes one team to come and screw it all up. So we'll see exactly what happens when it comes to Caden. But the biggest needs for the New Orleans Saints are going to be on their defensive line. Defensive interior, they don't have any players in the contract. Can you keep David Onyemata? Can you add a Kalijah Kancey? Can you go deeper in the draft and find other guys like Keanu Benton or you're not necessarily later, but you could also, instead of grabbing a Kalijah Kancey, you can grab a Mozzie Smith, guys like that. Like there's a lot of options. It's very deep in the interior defensive line in this year's draft, particularly for run stuffers, but you can find those pass rushers in there like Kancey, like Mozzie. And then the other spot that they can go is free agency. Larry Ogunjobi, A'Shawn Robinson, lots of others that are available in this year's class. So lots of really good ones where the Saints can do that. But if they get those spots right and continue to build this roster around Derek Carr, they're in a good place. And thankfully for the Saints, and for Derek Carr for that matter, they landed on a contract structure that should allow them to do that. Let's break that down and why it's so important as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with a quick update on Derek Carr's contract status and structure. We got some reports on the contract structure from PFT. SpotRack, Over the Cap have also updated their contract structure, so we're pretty confident that this is what Derek Carr's contract looks like. So let's break it all down, although some of these numbers may shift and change between the time that I record this and later on once that full contract structure becomes official. But it looks like we have a little bit of an early glance at it. Real quick, one thing that I want to add to the last conversation around the things that the New Orleans Saints need to get right. A big part of what they need to get right, I mentioned in the opener of today's show as well, which is play calling, offensive struggle, well, correcting the offensive struggles and getting that system schematically ready as well. So I don't want to miss that. Like that falls into that conversation as well. But for the Saints to do that, finding the right players to help them do it becomes a little bit easier thanks to Derek Carr's contract structure. So a lot of people a little bit upset around Derek Carr's contract. 4 years, $150 million. That comes out to an average of $37.5 million. That puts him right above the $35 million per year or $35 million contract that Kirk Cousins just got this past offseason. This is about where we expected Derek Carr to land. But keep this in mind. There's a difference between average per year of all dollars and average per year when it comes to guaranteed money. So when you look at what the total guarantees are on this contract, $100 million. And those $100 million will have paid out in their entirety between 2003 to 2005. The only exception being the last remaining couple of years where the signing bonus goes into 2026 and then the void year of 2027. So what that means is that another way to look at this contract, instead of it being a 4-year, $150 million contract, is that it's a 3-year, $100 million contract. $33.3 million per year. That puts him below Kirk Cousins. That puts him around Jared Goff. That's not a bad contract for Derek Carr, who, again, is going to be the best quarterback, at least right now, in the division, depending upon what happens with Lamar Jackson. But again, I don't think Lamar Jackson leaves Baltimore. We'll see how that all goes. And one of the, let's say, top 6, top 7 quarterbacks in the NFC. I mean, you can put Jalen Hurts, obviously, at the very top, depending upon how you feel about Aaron Rodgers, but also depending upon whether or not Aaron Rodgers is back in the NFC with the Packers in 2023. Then you look at the other really good quarterbacks this year. Dak Prescott, maybe, right? Who's the quarterback in San Francisco? That would end up having a little bit of an impact. How far along does Jalen Hurts come? How far along does Daniel Jones come? There's not a lot of really good quarterbacks left in the NFC. And so when you think about the idea of Derek Carr being just below a Kirk Cousins, being paid just below a Kirk Cousins in terms of the guarantees versus him being probably better than Kirk Cousins, ain't that hard a pill to swallow. Not in the NFC, where the quarterback play is not tremendous, particularly in the NFC South, where it's dismal. So when you look at Derek Carr's contract, 3 years, $100 million to pay out that guarantee of $100 million, not too bad, not too shabby. There's a whole $50 million base salary that's non-guaranteed in 2026 when he turns 35 years old. Either he'll never see that money, or the Saints will extend and push that money and create new years and create new money in an extension, not a restructure, but an extension to keep him in New Orleans. Because if he's getting to the 4th year of his contract, then he's probably performing really well. In 2023, the expectation is that he will have a $1.5 million base salary. This is almost exactly what we spoke about in yesterday's second episode when we were previewing what the contract might look like. With a signing bonus of $28.5 million, again, almost exactly what we spoke about in yesterday's episode. I think we said $30 million. That's an average of about $5.7 million per year. So the reason why I mention that is that if you take $5.7 million per year, which is the pro rate of the $28.5 million signing bonus, and add the only other money that Derek Carr is getting in 2023, which is the $1.5 million base salary, his salary cap hit in 2023 is expected to be just $7.2 million. You can save more money than that by moving on from Jameis Winston as a post-June 1 cut, which is likely to happen anyway. Whether it's a post-June 1 cut or an outright cut, we'll see. But either way, the Saints have done it again. Low first year. They have a $30 million base salary in 2024, 2025. Some of that can get restructured that will add guaranteed money down the road. But it's not the end of the world for the New Orleans Saints. Because if he's playing into his 3rd year, if he's playing into his 2nd year, then you can assume that he played well his first couple of years. So for the Saints, they're in a situation here to where 1 year down the road, when Lamar Jackson's contract is done, Justin Herbert's getting his contract, Jalen Hurts is getting his contract, Joe Burrow is getting his contract, Daniel Jones has his contract. All of a sudden, we're going to be talking about the New Orleans Saints having a quarterback that at most is counting on average $37.5 million per year. Those guys are going to be in the 40s, 50s, potentially. He's just going to continue to fall down that quarterback sort of pay scale as the years go on. And I'm not talking about 4 years down the road. I'm not saying that that's going to happen when he's lived out the entire life of his contract. That's going to happen as soon as next year. So don't be worried too much about a $37.5 million average per year. That's a fake number. The real number here is 3 years, $33.3 million. $100 million guaranteed over 3 seasons. You won't be surprised to know that the Saints also gave, especially if you're a longtime listener and watcher of this show, that the Saints also gave him a $10 million roster bonus in 2025. You know what that means? They're going to restructure that. They're going to convert that. That's going to be money that they're going to be set and ready to push down the road because it was already guaranteed anyway, so it doesn't matter. Kai Harley's doing it again. Mickey Loomis doing it again. The New Orleans Saints doing it again. So all of those things that we just outlined in terms of the improvements that the Saints still need to make on the team, and maybe I'm being a little harsh on some of those, right? But the ones that I know for sure the Saints also see wide receiver, contested catchability, 50-50 ball, all that. Defensive interior, because they ain't got none on contract. Running back, right? Those are the three big needs that the New Orleans Saints have already started to acknowledge. And everyone, all of us in Indianapolis heard about. They have now signed their quarterback and solved their quarterback issue, right? Solved their quarterback problem, while also saving themselves the space to be able to address every one of them things that we just highlighted. So the Saints doing it again in a really good position here with this Derek Carr contract. Coming up in tomorrow's episode, who are some of the players that can answer some of those questions? You'll hear from Tulane running back Tyjae Spears, how he feels about the New Orleans Saints organization. And we'll also take a look at how Derek Carr impacts players currently on the roster, like Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, Juwan Johnson, and more. Break all that down in tomorrow's episode of Locked On Saints. Appreciate you as always for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. For your second listen, make sure you go and check out Locked On NFL Draft. Damian Parson, Keith Sanchez, keeping you up to date with everything you need to know around the biggest prospects in this year's draft, the sleepers, and the hidden gems that can change your favorite football franchise. Find it wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube as well. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much for making Locked On Saints a part of your day, a part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show, for allowing me to earn your viewership and your listenership. Thank you very much for all of the support over the course of this week. It's about to be a very fun week here on Locked On Saints. As always, if you see me, say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.